Welcome, everyone, to the Bamboo Garden Wellness Podcast, Episode 3. I am Dr. Michelle Dexter, the owner of the Bamboo Garden Wellness Center and your co-host of the Bamboo Garden Wellness Podcast. I'd like to welcome our guest today, which is David Blair, who's a marriage and family therapist who specializes in a number of things, but most notably IFS, which is internal family systems, and neurofeedback. And he also has a background in NLP or neuro-linguistic programming. So welcome, David.
Thank you so much.
Glad you're here.
I am too.
Yes. So David, you've had a number of years of experience in IFS, NLP, and neurofeedback.
Yes.
Yes. Would you like to share a little bit about your biography with us?
Well, I've worked in mental wellness and healthcare for over 40 years at all different levels. I've worked in patient psychiatry, outpatient psychiatry, and for the last 20 years, I've concentrated on one-on-one small group in a private office, private practice for the last 20 years.
And who do you like to specialize in seeing now?
I have a wide variety of clients from age 3, 4, up to in their 80s.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah.
And so you don't have a preference for age or gender or anything like that?
No, I like the diversity though.
Okay.
That's very rewarding. It helps me develop my skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with IFS, internal family systems. So for our audience, why don't you tell them a little bit about what that is and what it looks like?
Certainly. IFS is a very gentle, compassionate approach to helping people integrate different aspects of themselves and develop more compassionate, calm relationships with the different aspects of themselves, the different parts of themselves. It's very valuable in terms of treating trauma, complex trauma, and it's also very helpful with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. So in collaborating with a client, I allow the client to develop the ability to observe the different parts of themselves from a mindful place and begin to understand the reactive emotions, the overwhelm, the trauma in a safe, supported way, where they begin to shift the relationship, those parts of themselves that they may have wanted to get rid of or suppress or detach or distract from. And over time, at a pace that's right for them, they begin to bring these different parts of themselves into a much more harmonious relationship by integrating the different parts and dissipating the reactive emotions and learning a process for healing and releasing the trauma. So those parts of them can be updated and be more present in a current time.
Can you give an example of parts?
Sure. I remember working with a client who was in his late 60s, 68, and he lost his mother very tragically at the age of 5 to a very debilitating disease. So she had already become sick. And there were parts of him that were operating from that 5-year-old perspective that had a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, right? And worked very hard to take care of things, right? That part was somewhat parentified and often trying to take care of others and also trying to control situations greatly. And he had never been able to properly grieve the loss of his mother. His father, who suddenly became a single father, in that generation, and his father also suffered from PTSD from World War II, didn't know how to talk to his little boy, right, about the loss of his mother. The father was grief-stricken as well and not very available for the father. And there was a little sister involved too. So not only was his father unavailable, and what had happened to his mother really didn't get discussed. He was actually sent away for a few days, and did not attend the funeral, right? And was very anxious about what was happening and trying to care for his little sister as well. The aunts that he was were very loving. They also, though, did not talk about it. So a good deal of his life had been driven by this younger part, right? In terms of making decisions and reacting building up a very successful business, but with a lot of anxiety and attempting to control a lot of the variables around him. When he was finally able, and it took some time to learn how to be with that younger part of himself and go back in time and witness the grief, right? Witness all the emotions this little one had. So until that part of him was fully validated, right? Once that was done, he was also able to go back to that younger part and help that little one meet his needs once and for all.
Yeah.
When that part of the process had been done, we were able to invite that part of him into the present and recognize him from his higher self and his adult self, being able then to protect him from that higher self and to manage activities. So no longer was there this burden on a 5-year-old part of him to manage all of these adult activities. And happy to report that his anxiety levels went way down. His family was much very happy for him because he started to become more relaxed, more happy. And in addition to that, once that young part of him had been healed, right, we also had the opportunity to allow it to transform. The role that that child wanted to take on now, in the present time, protected by the higher self and the older self, was one of adventure and playfulness. So this client created many opportunities for that young boy part of him to be present with his wife and his children, to have more fun, more adventure, and have some playfulness.
That sounds great. So in the language of NLP, that sounds that you took a stuck or an immature part and you grew it up to its current age.
But I utilized the NLP differently than that, in terms of using more modalities and sequence and things like that. The parts, we don't force them, we invite them, we allow them. So for him, that part actually wanted to stay in the child role, playfulness and adventure, and just have a very harmonious relationship with the client's older self.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That sounds really perfect for the situation.
Yeah, it was a very nice outcome.
Good. Now, what about disowned parts or disowning parts, things like that? Is that part of the work you do?
Well, when people are detached from a part or they're trying to get rid of a part, that causes a lot of reactivity. It causes a lot of polarity inside one's system, and a lack of coherence and resonance. So I work very closely with clients to integrate their parts, and understand that at one point in time, that part had an adaptive function.
Yes.
And it may have found one way to cope with overwhelm, cope with trauma. And so it was adaptive in the past at one point. And that learning to have compassion and understanding for that adaptiveness, right, allows the person to start owning the part again and creating a whole new relationship.
Yes.
We really can't get rid of aspects of ourselves. We can transform those aspects into more harmonious, coherent relationships.
Right. And it also sounds like more adaptive aspects of ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. And to bring that to the present time.
Yes.
So that we're adapting to present circumstances. It's not the circumstances of a traumatized 5-year-old who just lost his mom.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share about IFS in the moment?
It's non-pathologizing. It's gentle yet very powerful. And clients can learn how to do this between sessions, right? So eventually they learn the skills. Sometimes I'll have clients working with a notebook, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, so I'm working with systems. So I often have more than one family member learning how to relate through the lens of different parts of ourselves and learning how to get those needs met in a family. I also work with corporations where I may be having different people in the corporation teaching in this kind of language.
Well, that sounds great, because obviously in a system, all parts interact.
Yeah.
And all parts are having influence over one another.
Yes.
So I'm thinking you would probably agree with the statement that if we heal one part of the system, the other parts get to benefit.
Yes. Yeah. And learning how to help people speak for those parts in a
Yes.
constructive way, where now they're starting to get their needs met or their wants and preferences, and also start to speak for their values. So they're being heard for their values, right?
Will you say more about that, about values?
Yeah, people, whether we know it or not, our behavior is often very driven by values. They may be values of family, they may be of um, values of health, they may be values of excitement. And when people start getting in touch with what's beneath their behavior, like what values are at play, well, the value of respect, the value of honesty, right? And then they can speak for those values and times when they feel those values are being threatened. And I also collaborate with clients around nonviolent compassionate communication. So they can learn to speak for those values in a way that the other person could better hear.
Do you have an example of that pops into your brain?
Oh, yes. I'm currently working with somebody in a corporation, and they actually have strong values for loyalty, clear communication, and respect. And they're working with a partner who's got different values, and this person is experiencing those values as being threatened because they're not being understood, they're not being acknowledged, right? So now, when both of those parties in that corporation can begin to speak for their values, right? They can start understanding what was driving the behavior, what was driving the decisions that were made in the corporation. Often people are making decisions or forcing decisions without being able to speak for the value, right? So now this company, on a short period of time, another one of the values is unity and teamwork and collaboration. So one partner had those values. Now that they're beginning to understand, there are three founders of this company, they're beginning to speak for those values and hear each other. They're starting to understand why they were pushing for different decisions.
Got it. So that sounds like that is an opportunity for some conflict resolution.
Yes, yeah. And people learning how to do that themselves.
Right, right. Because I will tell you, after having been in practice for more than 2 decades, that I hear that a lot about I feel voiceless, and I'm sure you have too.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
And that part that needs to be heard
yes,
will probably have reactions.
Yes.
Anger, frustration, sadness.
yes,
And those reactive emotions are there to protect us. And if we can learn to observe them and speak for them, they can start to dissipate
yes.
and be integrated and yet still be spoken for in a way that other people can better hear.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you use NLP in a different way than I mentioned. So would you like to explain about your philosophy or practice with NLP?
Well, one, I practice NLP from the heart, right? And I mean that not just metaphorically. As human beings, the electromagnetic field of our heart is one of the strongest parts of our nervous system. So some people, I think, are using the NLP in a very technical way, or sometimes even a manipulative way. I'm using it in a more transparent way to help people understand the sequences and the sensory modalities that they're taking the world into. Some people may take the world in certain contexts much more through the visual world. Some people may take it much more through the auditory world. Some people may take it much more through feelings and kinesthetics. I remember, I could give you an example if you'd like.
Yes, please.
I remember a little boy that I was working with who was taking in the world in a very auditory way. And his single mom was getting really frustrated with his apparent inability to spell, and thinking he was being judged as lazy, um, oppositional defiant, right? And when I started exploring the strategy he was using to spell in the English language, it was pretty much auditory.
Oh, phonetics.
Yeah, which they don't teach the phonetic alphabet anymore. And he was trying to spell out the words. So we simply practice an exercise where he began to visualize a letter in his favorite color on a blank wall. And before long, he was able to visualize small words, right? Within 2 weeks, he was able to do more palindromes than his mom, spelling words backwards and forward. He started having fun with spelling once he had a strategy that was most efficient for the English language. So that's an example of helping people learn about how they're taken in the world, and maybe even having some shifts according to the context that they might be struggling in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I've heard of children who are visual, because NLP, obviously, the idea is that the visual cortices are up here. And so children will be looking up here, and then the teacher will think that the child isn't paying attention. And that's actually not true, of course.
Yes, yes. Very, and helping people learn these skills sometimes helps them learn how to manage in different classroom styles better.
Right.
And to be less labeled.
Right.
All right.
Right. Yeah, because there's obviously many, many, many ways to take in information and to learn.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about NLP?
No, I think.
Okay. Right. Then let's move on to neurofeedback. So,
wonderful.
Yeah, so I understand neurofeedback has really evolved in the last decade or two. And so why don't you talk about how it's evolved and how it's done now and what it can do?
Sure. I provide Optimer method neurofeedback, right? And it's a non-invasive, we're not sending anything into the brain. We put electrodes on the scalp. The electrodes are reading the electrical activity of the brain in the form of an EEG signal, which is fed into a computer. That computer takes that data and puts it into a visual feedback system, which is a screen that the client looks at, a tactile device, which is like a little teddy bear that vibrates more or less, and a speaker system that gets louder and softer. Now, when those signals are changing, when the client's hooked up to the device, right, the electrical activity of their neurons firing, right, changes those signals. So the colors will get brighter, they'll move differently, the teddy bear will vibrate more or less, the audio will go up and down. And within a minute, the brain is beginning to retrain its own electrical firing to a calm, alert, stable, resilient state.
So in other words, a higher functioning state.
A more regulated state, a much more regulated state. And can I give you an example of that?
Yes, please.
For example, if I was working with a little girl, maybe that had a seizure disorder, right? Maybe the seizures were located in the left front part of the brain, right? Within a minute or two, the brain is able to read through those signaling changes that the electrical firing is too fast, right? And too close together. So it begins to calm that down and spread out the electrical firing because the brain wants to perform optimally. And given that new information, this exquisite feedback information, it can quickly go to more optimal performance, right? And this is working with the whole nervous system. You can think of the brain as the nervous system distributed broadly throughout the whole body, which includes the heart, which includes the gut, which includes all the extremities, right? So the neurofeedback is working with the whole nervous system, and it wants to move to a much more optimal regulation and performance.
Excellent. So in the Optimer mechanism or method, so when they're looking at the screen, what type of thing might they see?
Oh, they can choose from a variety of delightful environments that are nature-like.
Okay.
Right? With the Optimer method, we're not trying to force the brain to go in a particular direction. We're not taking a bias towards trying to shift this brain into a particular direction. What we're doing is setting up an environment where the brain, right, can assess its own functioning and move towards its own optimal state. That's what sets the Optimer method aside from some of the others, which makes it also more gentle, right? It's working with that inner healer.
Right.
Similar to what we do in IFS. It's very integrative, and we're allowing the inner healer, the higher self, to integrate the different parts.
Yes.
Well, with neurofeedback, if there's a part of the nervous system, part of the brain, it could be the gut brain, the heart brain, that's too highly aroused, the neurofeedback starts to calm that part of the brain down, right? If there's a part of the brain that's been fragmented, that's been suppressed, right? Maybe due to trauma, it could be head trauma or emotional trauma. Neurofeedback doesn't care when the trauma happened, doesn't care how it happened. It wants to create integration. So maybe parts of the nervous system have been fragmented by that trauma. The neurofeedback will allow those different parts of the brain to start to connect, make new neural connections, and start firing in communication, neuronal firing in communication.
So it sounds like that it's possible that somebody could get some of that optimal, or I should say, a restoration of some of that neurological firing or capabilities back.
Yes. So in the first stage, it's mostly a bioelectrical change, and that kind of dissipates. The second stage, we see better neurochemical balance. Medications have to be adjusted. Sometimes people go off medications. In the third stage, we can see changes in SPECT scans and functional MRIs.
That's great.
So we can actually see structural brain changes, which in terms of traumatic brain injury and stroke is really good news.
No, that's
So
great.
the brain will find workarounds,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then the neurofeedback really does that efficiently.
Nice.
Yeah.
So in a typical person, and I realize that every case is different, and I realize that there's wide variety in the kinds of things you're treating.
Yep.
But if we were going to say, on average, how long would it take for somebody to say, oh, I'm really noticing changes?
Oh, well, that can happen in the first session.
Oh, that's great.
I remember a young client 6-year-old client who was suffering with high levels of anxiety and obsessive behaviors. In the first training at the end, you just met me, gave me a big hug and said, that's the calmest I've ever been.
Oh, that's amazing.
Right? Yeah.
That's great.
And so his trauma was not particularly complex. He had both parents available, both of them were available, pretty secure household, right? So within the first 10 sessions, we saw significant changes in the home, less fighting with his sister, less fighting with the parents, right? So much calmer behavior in the household. And within 20 sessions, the school started to report he was making friends.
Oh,
He was able to pay much more attention. His attention had been on the part of him that was so anxious, which made it really hard for him to take in information from the teacher.
right.
So within about 20 sessions, the school started reporting a lot of progress.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. Would you like to say anything else about neurofeedback?
Well, it can be used in a wide variety of settings. With neurofeedback, you are not changing these signals. You're not changing the images and the tactile vibrations, the auditory consciously. The brain is doing that unconsciously, which is really important if I'm working with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or somebody who's had a stroke, right? They're not having to force their brain to work in a particular way. The brain is leading the way.
That's great.
And that's different than biofeedback. Biofeedback, you're consciously maybe controlling your breathing and getting some kind of a signal fed back to you that your breathing is in a more calm, responsive way. With the neurofeedback, it's working with the whole nervous system, right? And it's doing that so you don't have to make a conscious effort.
It's wonderful.
Which you can do this. Research has been done on this with cats, with chimpanzees. So it's goes in unconsciously.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in psychology that we've looked at the neurology of the unconscious mind and determined that that's about 85 to 90% of the mind. So it seems to me that anything we can do to help that part of the mind is going to be, very useful. And
yes. And again, that correlates well with internal family systems.
Yes.
Because a lot of times it's parts that have emotionally had really strong emotional experiences that there's an emotional learning down in the emotional brain. So that's why sometimes we're consciously realizing that's not the logical behavior that I'm engaging in. Why am I doing that?
Right.
Well, there's a deeper level to it, an emotional learning, and often beliefs associated with that. They're below the level of awareness. With neurofeedback, internal family systems, we're starting to bring those things back into integration, back into awareness, and back into the present time for more fluid flowing function and more harmony within the system, within the person.
And it sounds like, based on what you just said, that it might also be that new conclusions or new beliefs emerge that might be much more affirming or useful.
Oh, yes. And when we're doing the internal family systems, we take a look at what beliefs did that little young part of you take on and release those beliefs,
Yes.
and then allow that part to choose what would be a more empowering belief. Right.
Yes.
So, yeah, very much so.
Right. Are there any particular types of cases? I mean, I know you work on a wide variety of things, but is there any particular case that you really enjoy working with?
In terms of both IFS?
Oh, all of it, the whole thing.
Yeah. I am thinking of one client who was diagnosed with temporal lobe dementia, which is a really devastating diagnosis, a very person with a robust life, and high functioning, and came in for the neurofeedback and doing it on quite a regular basis, making some lifestyle changes, making some dietary changes. They actually got accepted into a research program at UCSD, right? But on a long waiting list. Well, he had trained for about a year and 8 months when he got off the waiting list, and they took him back in and had to retest him. He no longer tested positive for the temporal lobe, and that he was tested by 2 psychiatrists. Right now, he was no longer testing for that.
That's great.
Now, some of his brain scans were still, he was an older person and had a lot of traumatic brain injury as a kid. But his functioning was restored to the point where he no longer tested positive for that.
Yeah, still, that's a win.
Yeah, which was a lot of relief for him, a lot less stress for the family. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know?
Well, I think in this day and age that approaches that are non-pathologizing, that are integrative, that are collaborative, that are based on compassion, right? Compassion for ourselves, compassion for others, and leading to inspired action and building communities around that, whether it's your family, whether it's a business. I think those are really important aspects or important practices. I think all of these things involve a lot of practice, and learning how to have those practices with each other in whatever context is bringing a lot of healing to the world. And I'm glad for the Bamboo Wellness Center, because to me, that is a collective of different wellness providers that are creating a community to share.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're so glad you're with us.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, David, for your expertise and
pleasure.
for sharing. This is wonderful. And if you'd like to be in contact with David, the contact information is available here. Thank you so much for joining us today.